This next person coming to the stage really actually doesn't need much of an introduction to any folks who have been involved in the blockchain space for a while. Dax is managing partner at Perkins Coie. A brief story, when I first started working on this conference and was just trying to figure out who I needed to connect with in the blockchain space, I had a friend, my wife's friend's husband, dinner. Oh, he works at Perkins. I said, hey, you know, I'd really like an introduction to this Dax Hansen. And he says, Dax, you know, he's pretty busy. I'm not, you know, I don't know what kind of response you'll get, but, you know, I'm happy to make an introduction. And Dax epitomizes what community is in the blockchain space, because not only was he responsive and took a meeting, he's been unbelievably supportive of not just my efforts, but the efforts of the entire Seattle blockchain community. So he's one of the most well-versed people, particularly around legal issues in this space, and it's pretty much not a topic that he's talking about that I wouldn't be excited and encourage you to listen to. So with that, Dax Hansen.
Thank you for that nice intro. Well, thank you, Chris. Appreciate the kind comments there. How many people here think they understand what a smart contract is, or has confidence that they know what a smart contract is and how it works? Okay, a few. I haven't had confidence, and I still have just a little bit of confidence now, even though I've been working on it for quite a while in the space. But my plan here today is to spend a few minutes talking about smart contracts and their applications and some other issues, some observations as a practitioner in the space. I ran into Joseph Williams earlier today, and he reminded me that the title of this presentation could have been reworded a number of different ways. It's not necessarily that we don't need new blockchain laws or crypto laws, but it could mean really that we don't need the type of law that's been recently introduced. And I'll tell you what we mean by that. So I want to cover 4 things today, and maybe a fifth here. But the first is just to go through what a smart contract is, just to demystify it a little bit, get back to the definitions. The second idea is to talk about the applications in which smart contracts are being used currently, and then to drill down on 1 or 2 particular use cases, and then focus a little bit on what the states have been introducing in terms of legislation, and talk about whether we need that or whether we need something different, but at least to get a dialogue going. And lastly, just to point you to a couple of resources. So there's lots of definitions of smart contracts. I like the definition from Richard Gendel Brown from R3. That's a helpful definition in my mind. And I want to go through a few elements of that. But it's also just appropriate to note that smart contracts are not necessarily smart, and they're not necessarily contracts, right? So it leaves us in this sort of gray zone to understand what they really are. The key aspects of a smart contract, in my mind, are that they are software programs that are like executables that will reside in the blockchain and can be executed from the blockchain. They have event-driven functionality, meaning that they can be influenced by external triggers or events and update the status of the functionality of the contract itself. That the inputs can be fed in from third-party sources that we call oracles, and that these programs can update their status and their state in terms of time, location, values, dollar amounts, etc. So they're very dynamic. They are intended to be autonomous, meaning that they will run without the intervention of another actor. And they are oftentimes designed to be like sensor resistant, that they won't come down, they won't crash, since they're not running necessarily on a centralized server. And that the people who are interacting with them have some confidence that they will be executed pursuant to their terms, and they won't be unwound as long as the conditions that were set forth in the code were met. So as you can see, that's a very technical description of a smart contract, and there isn't necessarily a legal contract in there. If you think about a legal contract, if you've gone to law school or you play a lawyer on TV, you'll know that contracts have to have offer, acceptance, and consideration. And there may be many instances where a contract that has offer, acceptance, consideration can be a smart contract, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a smart contract. I think of three different categories to keep this kind of straight in my mind. One, you have the technical description. It's an automated if-then statement. If certain conditions are met, then something happens, i.e. assets over which custody has been maintained will be released, or information will be released, or you look in a certain location for next step, right? It's automated if-then statements, very technical. Two would be the what we call Ricardian contracts or smart legal contracts, where it actually is a legal contract that is also meshed with code, and sometimes may be entirely written in code, but is intended to be a legal contract. Better, smarter, faster, quicker, automated legal contracts. That's a whole different category. And lastly, there are what I'll call just additional contracts, T's and C's, either paper or electronic, that are surrounding a smart contracts platform. And these are not necessarily smart contracts. These are just the good old-fashioned contracts that govern how one might interact with a platform, with liability allocations, with fee sharing, with dispute resolution, things that we want a legal system and a court or an arbitrator to help us decide. Something that has some flexibility around it. So the first category of smart contract applications really, in my mind, is the functionality of a smart application, like a decentralized application, as well as a token sale that is conducted to get that token out into the public. And some of you who have been in the industry for a while may have known last May, a year ago, that there was a lot of attention when the Brave founders did a token sale for a basic attention token. It was clear that in like 24 seconds, 2 cycles of the Ethereum blockchain, they were able to clear and settle I think it's about $35 million worth of Ether for the sale of a token that has application in a privacy-enhancing advertising and browser situation. There's a couple of contracts in there. The first one was just the execution of the Ethereum for the new token. That was a smart contract. Send an Ether, get back the smart contract. It happened. It's tech that works. There are other applications like 0x where the token is intended to facilitate a protocol for like decentralized exchange of other ERC20 tokens. And there are other applications like Metronome, which is a currency, but that lives entirely within smart contracts. And we'll talk about that one a little bit more in detail. This is the world that I've lived in for the last few years, that I've seen these applications that aren't necessarily legal contracts that are using the Ethereum and the R3 and the other definitions of smart contracts. Not necessarily legal contracts, but technology that works to execute an if-then statement. But there have been other applications that have been identified as great candidates for smart contracts technology. And the capital market space is one that that is currently very hot. There's lots of innovation happening, lots of investment in this space. And a couple of examples are Polymath and T0, but Polymath is intended to be a platform for the issuance of security tokens. It's a new standard for sale of securities that are themselves tokenized. There would be a smart contract for the sale of a token that they sold, that's a utility token, and then there is the creation of these Ricardian contracts for private placement documents, for instance, that are smart, that do get recorded on a blockchain and can be updated in conjunction with a private placement. T0 is a similar platform in that regard. There's a whole host of supply chain application uses. IBM and SAP and others have been focused on tracking the provenance of food, for instance, vegetables or meat, or in mining, identifying where gold might be coming from and confirming that it's not coming from a conflict region, all the way through from the mine to the refineries to the vaults, for instance, and then on to financial institutions and into jewelries and into electronic manufacturing. These areas are emerging for sure. A lot of exploration right now. Governments and smart cities, where, for instance, Dubai has decided to make their government blockchain enabled by 2020. And this extends to things like registries and government IDs and other things that are tracked on a blockchain. Illinois has been experimented with real property registries and how to automate some of the processes around recording and transferring real property. And Delaware, in addition to updating its laws to deal with securities and to identify that we can have uncertificated shares, they have also been, for instance, running programs to handle the deletion or the automatic identification of public records that need to be expunged by putting in place rule sets around data that's being stored in databases and identifying them for deletion. I mentioned real estate registries with Illinois, but there are other jurisdictions that just don't have good property registries. And they've been identifying technologies, recording technologies like Factum, which is a fairly old technology in this space, one of the pioneers in the space. But to be able to record transfers, record different changes in ownership of property. And so you see a number of jurisdictions like Honduras and Greece and Sweden that are experimenting with those capabilities. And then lastly, we have projects like Sovereign and Civic that are blockchain-based self-sovereign identity solutions, where we were able to turn upside down the construct around identities. Rather than having people own your information and have data stores of them, you're able to share selectively information about yourself and maybe have third parties verify claims about you. For instance, that I am over 18, that I live in Washington, that I have been verified as a pre-check traveler, for instance, or that I have a driver's license. And these things can enable me to get into certain services without having to disclose all of my personal information that might be later hacked. So there's automation of the sharing of personal information, and this is underway now. Metronome, to me, is a project that's worth spending more time reading about. Metronome was designed to be a currency that had a predictable supply rate, that the currency would come into existence on some sort of predictable schedule, as opposed to, for instance, there being 21 million Bitcoin and that's the end. That the intent is that there would be a currency that lives forever. And there would also be a monetary policy built into the smart contracts. And so the authors of Metronome did create a series of at least 4 types of smart contracts that manage the distribution of the token, some auctions, some exchange capabilities, and it's a robust set of smart contracts. The folks who helped design Metronome, I think, are here. They will be here at this conference, and I would recommend you take some time to explore that, since this is, in terms of the technological advancement, fairly important in my opinion. Okay, so there are a number of different initiatives and a number of different white papers for your review, for our review, a body of work that's being developed around smart contracts. There are two initiatives from the Chamber of Digital Commerce. They have a Smart Contracts Alliance that's been going now for a year and a half or 2 years and putting out white papers. They're about to release their second white paper, which is fairly detailed. And there's a Token Alliance project that deals with actually the creation of tokens, and we'll talk to some extent about smart contracts. And then there are projects like the Accord Project and Open Law and the Stanford Computable Contracts Initiative that are focused more on the smart legal contracts, the Ricardian contracts, of how we can create better contracts. For instance, if you have a payroll agreement that had an obligation to pay money where we normally think you'd pay the wages on a weekly basis, if you build a wallet into it and some sort of oracle that's tied to the time card, one could imagine being paid on an hourly basis or a minute-by-minute basis based on the services performed. And you can also imagine things like patent assignment instruments that can go out and look for the latest update to a patent portfolio, and it doesn't have to be manually input by the drafter of that document. Lots of interesting implementations where we're doing a mashup of legal contracts and computer code and trying to figure out how we understand what those mean, how to confirm that they will execute as written, to understand how to audit those, and how lawyers and developers both can each other understand at least the basic rules of the road around the law or the code. As for the state actions, we've seen recently, over the last year, a certain flavor of bill that's been introduced and then passed that really says that smart contracts will not be denied their validity or their enforceability simply because they are smart contracts that are recorded on a blockchain, for instance, or that are blockchain-based, or that smart contracts. And there's a number of definitions that have been identified in these bills and adopted. And so some of the lawyers in this space have gotten together and just tried to analyze whether we need these bills or whether we need something a little bit differently. And for instance, the paper that will be coming out in the next week or two from the Smart Contracts Alliance will get into the details of this. But the short version is that while the lawyers who are looking at the legal issues appreciate the efforts, that at least that current version of that bill isn't very helpful, and it creates a lot of confusion because it, for instance, identifies all smart contracts as valid. It suggests that they're contracts. And as we talked about earlier, a lot of smart contracts just aren't meant to be legal contracts. So we're creating, the implication that software code is a contract when it doesn't need to be. Second of all, there's overlap with the electronic signatures laws, both at the federal and the state level, that have already been passed and adopted. Washington has a slightly different digital signatures law than other states. But the short version is that there are already laws in place that confirm that a contract will not be denied enforceability simply because it's in electronic form or it's signed electronically, as long as certain conditions are met. And my view is that in many instances, or most instances, these laws cover the blockchain applications that we're looking at right now very well. Joseph Williams identified an area that I would like to spend some more time looking at, which is admissibility of evidence, for instance. There are federal rules of admission of contracts into a court system, which honestly I haven't looked at. And it may be that there are areas like that that need to be updated. And so we'll take that as homework back. But I guess my suggestion is that in many instances, if a state is trying to either solve a problem or trying to show support for the technology, it's worthwhile having a dialogue with industry, and the Chamber of Digital Commerce is a good place to start to understand what the issue is that we're trying to solve and to make sure we have an appropriate solution. So just to end, I'll just point you to a couple of resources. One is the Smart Contracts Alliance white paper from the Chamber of Digital Commerce. There's one that was released a year or so ago that's there in the middle. The one on the left should be coming out in the next week or two. Perkins Coie has written a couple of white papers, but our most recent one is talking about the legal aspects of smart contract applications and discussing the different categories of smart contracts. And those are, the white paper and others are available at the Perkins Coie blog at virtualcurrencyreport.com. So hopefully that helps. I'm happy to, like I say, I'm running out of time, but I'm happy to have conversations with any of you who see other issues related to smart contracts and how we might be able to identify the legal issues and the technology issues and find ways to have developers and lawyers working well together. Thank you for your time.